Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be talking about defense mechanisms in psychiatry. Defense mechanisms is a very commonly asked question in the medicine and the psychiatry exams in the final year examinations. It's also a very commonly asked question in the NEET exam and in the USMLE exams. So just before we talk about defense mechanisms, I just want to let you know a little bit about the id, ego and the superego. So according to Freud, he conceptualized human psyche into two parts, the conscious and the non-conscious. This non-conscious part, according to him, constitutes nearly 2/3 of our psyche, but we are not conscious about it and we do not know about it. This part, he said, is composed of three primary things, that is the id, the ego and the superego. Let's talk about what are these id, ego and superego, and then go on to what we understand by the term defense mechanisms and the types of defense mechanisms. So the id controls the primitive instincts and desires, that is, what we want to do. It is present since birth and influences sex and aggression. The ego, on the other hand, tries to accommodate reality. It is rational and it helps to resolve conflicts between the id and the superego. The superego determines our conscience or moral compass, that is, what we ought to do. It begins development by age 5 and is learned from caretakers. It insists on socially acceptable behavior, sometimes to the point of individual deprivation. So, defense mechanisms are the tools of the ego which it uses to manage the internal conflicts between the id and the superego. They are the means by which the ego wards off anxiety and it controls instinctive urges and unpleasant effects. With one exception, all defenses are unconscious. And what is that one exception? That is suppression. When you consciously suppress certain thoughts in your mind, that is a conscious thing that we do. And that is why it is the only defense mechanism which is conscious, whereas all the others are unconscious. We can divide defense mechanisms into two parts, that is mature defense mechanisms and immature defense mechanisms. There are four main mature defense mechanisms which can be remembered with the term SASH, that is suppression, altruism, sublimation and humor. In suppression, a person voluntarily pushes uncomfortable ideas or feelings out of the conscious mind. For example, a student consciously chooses not to think about the upcoming exams until a few days prior to that. In altruism, negative feelings about oneself are alleviated by helping other people. For example, a mafia boss makes a large donation to charity. In sublimation, we replace a socially unacceptable desire with an action that is similar, but it is socially acceptable. For example, a man having violent thoughts decides to pursue a career as a butcher. And in humor, we all know that we focus on the humorous aspect of an uncomfortable situation. For example, a nervous patient who jokes about an upcoming operation. So that finishes mature defense mechanisms. We can remember them with the help of a simple mnemonic. It is suppression, altruism, sublimation and humor. Coming to immature defense mechanisms. There are nearly 15 immature defense mechanisms that we have to remember, and I used a mnemonic for it, which was add flippers. That is, so this is the terms that will come out as we go through immature defense mechanisms. So there's a simple mnemonic that I used was add flippers, and if possible, please remember it like this because there are 4 immature mechanisms which start with R, 2 would start with P, 3 would start with I, and so on. So first we have acting out and the D's, that is denial, displacement and dissociation. So in acting out, socially unacceptable thoughts or feelings are expressed through attention-seeking actions, that is bad behavior. For example, a 16-year-old child whose parents are going through a divorce begins to skip classes so that she is paid attention to. So acting out is usually bad behavior when you're not able to express your feelings. Denial is refusing to acknowledge the reality of a painful experience. For example, a woman who refuses to believe that she was diagnosed with cancer. So she's in denial. Displacement is the transferring of an undesirable idea or feeling for one person onto another person. For example, a man who is angry at his boss will come home and yell at his kids because he cannot vent those feelings in front of the boss, right? So that is displacement. In dissociation, there is a temporary change in memory, personality or consciousness to avoid emotional stress. For example, a soldier who witnessed the murder of a friend has no memory of the incident. So this finishes the first part, that is acting out, denial, displacement and dissociation. Now coming on to the fixation, identification, intellectualization and isolation of affect. So we are coming on to the fixation, where you become obsessed with or attached to a person or an object or an event. For example, an adult avoids obligations by obsessively watching the sports channels. So that is fixation, where you're obsessed with one particular thing. In identification, you unconsciously mimic the behavior of someone who is often more influential or powerful. For example, an abused child grows up to abuse his own children. So you identify with that person who is the person in power or the person with influence, and you grow up to be like that person, or you act out like that person because you identify with them. Intellectualization is avoiding a distressing situation by focusing on the facts rather than emotions. For example, a doctor who is diagnosed with terminal cancer will focus on the pathophysiology of the disease rather than his emotions. So that is intellectualization, where you are removing the distressing thoughts and feelings. In isolation of affect, we exhibit a lack of emotional which is associated with a stressful situation. For example, a woman who witnessed a murder will describe the incident in graphic detail with no emotion. Isolation of affect is often seen in schizophrenic patients as well. So this is an immature defense mechanism. Coming on to passive aggression and projection. Passive aggression, we all know because it goes on among nearly all couples, in which we express negativity and perform below expectations as an indirect display of opposition. For example, a disgruntled employee is repeatedly late to work, right? And we all know what passive aggressive behavior is. It's seen in the majority of films. It's seen in a large number of relationships that we have, not only with girlfriends, boyfriends, but also among our own friend group as well. Projection, in which we attribute our own unacceptable feelings onto the other person. For example, a woman who has desires to cheat on her husband then projects them to her husband, and she is convinced that he wants or he is cheating on her. That is projection, where we give our feelings to another person and we project it on them. Rationalization is giving logical reasons for a negative situation so that you can convince yourself that the situation is a reasonable one and you can avoid self-blame. For example, a man who lost his job told his friends that it was a good thing because it would have been a very stressful position. So he's rationalizing it that as to why he or she did not make it to get the job or did not get the promotion. Reaction formation is replacing a personally unacceptable emotion with the opposite attitude. For example, a woman who unconsciously resents her marriage constantly showers her husband with affection and gifts. So this is very different from projection, see, where we have a desire that we project onto another person, that person is doing this. And in reaction formation, we have an unacceptable emotion, but we do the opposite. For example, if we do not like somebody, we shower them with gifts. And finally, the final leg of immature defense mechanisms, we have regression, repression and splitting. Regression is reversion to childlike behaviors, which is frequently seen in children in times of stress, like illness or punishment. Repression is when a desire is involuntarily excluded from a person's consciousness, versus suppression, where there is intentional withholding of the desire. So suppression is the only defense mechanism where the suppression happens consciously, whereas all the others are unconscious. Splitting is when you label people or situations as purely bad or purely good. This is commonly seen in borderline personality disorder. For example, a patient believes that the primary care physician is a terrible person, while the therapist is the most wonderful person in the world. So splitting is the diagnostic feature of borderline personality disorder. So this finishes mature and immature defense mechanisms. Thanks for listening, and if you like this video, then please like, share and subscribe and watch more videos like this one.